And speaking of shifts, there's this really interesting pattern I've noticed in the research.
Oh,
You know how there's all this talk about like a decade leap in technology, like these big jumps forward every 10
I think
years?
I've heard of that.
Yeah, well, they actually trace it all the way back to the 1940s.
Hmm.
So 1944, you have the first computer, 1954, the mainframe, then 1964, the mini computer,
Okay, yeah, I see the pattern.
right? And it keeps going. It's like clockwork. Each decade brings some fundamental shift in technology.
Well, that is fascinating. And 2024, the sources say that's pointing towards the decentralization of everything driven by AI, Web3, the metaverse, all that.
Right. So that makes you wonder, does this pattern hold up? Is it a reliable predictor?
It does make you think.
Oh, hey, I think our listeners got something to say.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you're talking about the fact that every decade something is happening, but what about in between? Do you have some examples of innovations that happen in between those decades?
Oh, that's a great question. You're right. It's not like tech just sits still for 9 years, then suddenly explodes. Okay, let's unpack this.
Exactly. While those decade shifts mark major paradigm changes, there are always important developments in between. It's more like an ebb and flow of innovation.
Right. It's a constant stream of improvement, just sometimes with bigger jumps than others, like the sources pointed out how the 1924 radio ad led to mass media.
True, but in between that, you had advancements in radio technology, like different types of receivers and broadcasting methods, right? It's not like everything was exactly the same for those 10 years.
Yeah. And then in the 1930s, you had the first television, which was huge. But in the time between, you had stuff like, oh, yeah. Uh huh.
What about, examples closer to us from the 2000s?
Absolutely, that's a great point. When we look at the 2000s, it's easy to focus on the big decade shifts, but there were plenty of important innovations in between, setting the stage for the tech we have today.
Yeah, you're totally right. We tend to think of things in these big chunks, but the real story is in all the little steps along the way. Here's where it gets really interesting.
For example, in the early 2000s, we saw the rise of broadband internet, which was a game changer for how we access information and entertainment. It wasn't as revolutionary as the internet itself, but it laid the groundwork for streaming and social media.
Right? It wasn't just about having the internet, but being able to use it at speeds that were actually usable. And then of course you had the explosion of the smartphone around 2007 with the first iPhone.
Exactly. Before that, we had cell phones, but the iPhone integrated the internet, apps, and a touchscreen in a way that hadn't been done before that really changed the game. But it was also the beginning of the App Store, which is a perfect example of an in-between innovation that would later become the norm.